My son's lawyer was mid-sentence when I stopped him. He was explaining to a judge, in that condescending tone lawyers use when they think you're already beaten, how my failing memory made me a danger to myself, how I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. His words hung in the air, thick with pity. Then I raised my hand. The lawyer stopped, surprised. I looked him right in the eye. "Mr. Davies," I said, and my voice was steadier than I ever thought it could be. "Before you continue outlining my incompetence, perhaps you'd like to discuss the terms of your lease?" He just stared, confused. I beg your pardon," he stammered. I leaned forward and allowed myself a small smile. "The lease for your law firm's offices," I explained. "The building at 452 West Elm. It's a lovely property. I should know. I own it. My name is Eleanor Vance. For years, I was the quiet matriarch, the supportive mother, the woman in the background. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my kindness was incompetence. They were wrong. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt like a ghost in your own home, then this story is for you. Stay with me, because what they started with a lie, I finished with the truth. For 3 years, I lived in my son's home. At least, that's what they called it. In reality, it was the house my late husband, Arthur, and I bought with our life savings, the house I signed over to them thinking it would keep the family close after Arthur passed. I moved into their guest room, a small, windowless space between the laundry and the garage, believing I was choosing family over loneliness. I learned, slowly, that sometimes they're the same thing. The disrespect began like a slow leak, a subtle drip you barely notice until the floor is warped. It was in the way my daughter-in-law, Susan, would reorganize the kitchen cupboards after I'd put the dishes away, moving my favorite teacup to a shelf I couldn't reach without a stool. It was in the way my son, Robert, would speak to me in that loud, slow voice people reserve for children and the hard of hearing, even though my mind was as sharp as ever. Just last month, we had my old friend Margaret over for lunch. I'd spent the morning making my famous lemon meringue pie, the one Robert used to beg for as a boy. As I served a slice to Margaret, Susan laughed a sharp, brittle sound. "You have to forgive Mom's baking," she told Margaret right in front of me. "It's a bit old-fashioned. We're more of a gluten-free household now." I said nothing. I just watched my friend Margaret take a bite and wink at me, saying, "Well, my old-fashioned tongue thinks it's divine." But the real strategy, their campaign, started when they needed money. Robert's boutique real estate firm was struggling, and Susan had dreams of launching an interior design consultancy. They saw my assets as their personal seed fund. To get to it, they first had to prove I was incapable of managing it. They started building a case against my mind. An appointment I was sure was on Tuesday would be on Wednesday. "Mom, you wrote it down wrong again," Robert would sigh, showing me the digital calendar he managed for me. A set of keys would go missing, only for Susan to find them in an obvious place, shaking her head with pity. "You've got to be more careful," she'd say. They were small things, tiny manufactured moments of confusion designed to make me doubt my own memory. They had forgotten who my husband was. Arthur wasn't just a quiet accountant. He was a brilliant and discreet investor in commercial real estate. When he passed, he didn't leave me with a simple savings account. He left me a portfolio of properties across the state, managed by his trusted advisor in Boston, Mr. Gable. He left me with power they never bothered to ask about. They saw a quiet widow living on a pension, not the silent owner of half a city block downtown. The cruelty became bolder. One morning, Susan walked into the kitchen as I was making breakfast. "Robert," she announced, not even looking at me, "did you remember to call the bank about the loan for the new venture? The underwriters are dragging their feet." Robert mumbled a yes before turning to me, his voice oozing with strained patience. "Mom," he asked, "did you remember to take your 10 a.m. medication? You forgot yesterday." I just nodded and said, "Yes, dear." I took it with my tea. I hadn't forgotten. She had moved the pillbox. That evening, I was in the living room reading when I overheard them in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the vents in this house carried secrets. I heard Susan on the phone. "Yes, Dr. Albright," she said. "She's been very forgetful lately, leaving the stove on, misplacing things." "No, she has no idea you're a psychiatrist. We told her you're an old university friend." "Yes, dinner on Thursday will be perfect." My blood went cold. They weren't just creating confusion. They were documenting it. They were bringing in a professional to witness the decline they had engineered. The day of the dinner, I felt a strange calm. I chose my dress carefully, a simple navy blue sheath, the one Arthur always said made my eyes look like the deep ocean. I was polite, I was charming, I was the perfect picture of a slightly dotty but sweet old woman. Dr. Albright began with his gentle, probing questions. "Susan tells me you sometimes have trouble recalling recent events," he said with that practiced, sympathetic smile. I smiled right back. "Oh, my memory isn't what it used to be," I replied. "But I remember the important things." He took the bait. "Like what?" he asked. I let my gaze drift from Robert to Susan, and I said, "I remember promises. I remember acts of kindness. And I remember betrayal." Later, standing in the shadows of the kitchen, I listened as my fate was decided. "Is it enough?" Susan whispered to the doctor. He confirmed it was. "With your testimony," he said, "we have enough to file a petition for conservatorship. It's for her own good, to protect her assets." Robert's voice was a weak protest. "I don't know, Susan, it feels wrong." And then I heard the words that finally, completely, severed the last thread of love I had for the boy I raised. Susan snapped back. "What feels wrong is letting her sit on a fortune while we're struggling. This is our future, Robert. She's had her life. It's our turn now." She's had her life. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It hardened into steel. They didn't see a mother. They saw an obstacle. And I decided then and there that this obstacle was about to become a mountain they could not move. The next morning, I didn't cry. I got organized. I found the old shoebox where I kept Arthur's papers. Tucked at the bottom was a business card for his financial advisor, Gable and Sons, Asset Management. I made the call from the garden, surrounded by the roses I had planted, the only corner of that house that still felt like mine. Mr. Gable remembered me instantly. His voice was warm but turned sharp and focused as I explained the situation. "They filed the petition this morning, Eleanor," he told me, his voice tight with anger on my behalf. "The hearing is in 1 week. They are moving fast." I simply told him, "So are we." My first request was for the tenant ledgers for my commercial properties. An hour later, they were in my email inbox. I sat in my room, scrolling through the files on my small tablet, and I almost laughed out loud. There, under the tenant list for the prestigious building at 452 West Elm, was Davies and Finch Law Associates, the firm Robert and Susan had hired to prove I was incompetent. And on the ledger for the building on Broad Street, the one with the highest foot traffic in the downtown core, was Robert Vance Realty. My son was paying rent, often late, I noted, to a holding company that I owned. The irony was so rich, so perfect, it was almost poetic. For the next week, I became a ghost in their house, playing my part. I forgot where I put my reading glasses. I asked what day it was twice at dinner. I let them see exactly what they wanted to see. I watched them build their case, documenting my every lapse in a shared note on Susan's phone, which she carelessly left on the kitchen counter one afternoon. Meanwhile, my real work happened in secret. Mr. Gable and I spoke every day. We compiled my entire portfolio, every deed, every title, every tax return, every lease agreement. We created a fortress of paperwork that proved not just my competence, but my dominion over the very world they moved through. The final piece of my plan involved the bank. First National, Mr. Gable confirmed. They're your largest tenant in the Commerce Drive building. They rent the entire 4th floor. I smiled. Perfect, I said. Please arrange a meeting for me with their head of commercial lending. Let's say Friday morning. I have some concerns about a potential new client of theirs that I'd like to discuss as a landlord. The meeting at the bank was a quiet exercise in power. I walked in not as a frail old woman, but as the owner of the building that housed their corporate offices. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply expressed concerns about the financial stability and character of 2 applicants for a large business loan, a Mr. Robert Vance and a Ms. Susan Clark. I mentioned their spotty rental history on another one of my properties. I didn't have to say more. The banker, a man whose bonus was tied to mitigating risk, understood perfectly. I spent the night before the hearing not in fear, but in quiet contemplation. I looked at an old photo of Arthur and me on our wedding day. He had a look in his eye that always said he knew I was stronger than I let on. You are right, my love, I whispered to the photo. It's time to stop being quiet. They thought they were cornering a feeble old woman. They had no idea they were walking into a cage of their own meticulous making. The hearing was held in a sterile conference room at the courthouse. Robert was the first to testify. And last week, he said, his voice heavy with false concern, she left the stove on all afternoon. If I hadn't come home, the whole house could have burned down. She's a danger to herself. It was a lie, of course. I had been making a slow-cooked stew, and he knew it. But the lie served his narrative. Susan was next, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. We love her so much, she claimed. This is the hardest decision we've ever had to make. But we just want to protect her and her finances. She's been making erratic decisions. They built their case brick by brick. When it was my turn, my lawyer simply asked if I had a statement to make. Yes, I would, I said, and I stood. I looked directly at their lawyer. Mr. Davies, I began. Before you continue outlining my incompetence, perhaps you'd like to discuss the terms of your lease? The room fell silent. I beg your pardon, he stammered. I explained calmly. The lease for your law firm's offices. The building at 452 West Elm. It's a lovely property. I should know. I own it. I placed a certified copy of the deed on the table. The judge leaned forward, a flicker of interest in his eyes. Mr. Davies stared at the document as if it were a snake. I then turned to my son. And Robert, I said, my voice even, your realty office on Broad Street? That beautiful corner unit? I own that building, too. I placed a second deed on the table. In fact, I announced, I own the entire commercial block. A fact you would have known if you'd ever bothered to ask about the business your father and I built. Due to this fraudulent attempt to have me declared incompetent, both of your leases are being terminated. You have 60 days to vacate. Susan jumped to her feet, her mask of concern gone, replaced by pure rage. You can't do that, she shouted. My voice was like ice when I replied, I can, and I have. I then addressed the judge. Your Honor, I explained, this hearing is nothing more than a fraudulent attempt by my son and his wife to seize control of my assets. Assets which, I might add, include the building where First National Bank, the very bank they are petitioning for a business loan, is a primary tenant. I had a very productive meeting with their head of lending last Friday. They are now reevaluating that loan application based on new information about the applicant's character. Robert slumped in his chair, utterly defeated. Susan stared at me, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. The judge, looking thoroughly unimpressed with their case, dismissed the petition in less than 5 minutes, with a sharp warning to Mr. Davies about filing frivolous claims. The trap was sprung. Their world had collapsed. The aftermath was as swift as it was total. Their loan was denied. Robert's realty firm, now homeless, folded within a month. Their lawyer, Mr. Davies, facing eviction and a potential ethics complaint, dropped them as clients. They had to sell their expensive car to cover their mounting credit card debt. They didn't lose because I was cruel. They lost because their entire life of success was built on a foundation they never knew I owned. I moved out of their house the next day. I didn't need to. It was, after all, still technically mine. But I wanted a space that held no memory of their betrayal. I found a beautiful condominium downtown, overlooking the park where Arthur and I used to walk. I spent my days reading, reconnecting with old friends like Margaret, and taking a surprisingly keen interest in the management of my commercial real estate empire. My son called, of course, many times. He begged. He apologized. He promised to change. I listened to one of his desperate voicemails, where he sobbed about how Susan had left him and how he had nowhere to go. I listened and then I deleted it. His apologies were just another transaction, another attempt to get something he wanted. I wasn't selling my peace anymore. If you have ever been called a burden, if you have ever been made to feel small in the house you helped build, if the people you gave everything to have started looking through you like you are already a ghost, then hear me now. You are not invisible. You are not a liability. You are a foundation. They see your kindness and call it weakness. They see your silence and call it consent. They see your age and call it incompetence. But you and I, we know the truth. Silence is not surrender. It is observation. Kindness is not a flaw. It is a strength they do not possess. And age is not a weakness. It is a library of every receipt, every broken promise, every quiet truth they thought you'd forgotten. They may have taken your energy, your time, even your money, but they cannot take your story. You are the one who holds the deed to your own life. You don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to fight to win. Sometimes, all you need to do is remember who you are, pick up the phone, and quietly, legally, and completely change the locks. My name is Eleanor, and I tell this story not for revenge, but for every woman who is tired of being underestimated. If this story spoke to you, if you see yourself in the quiet matriarch who finally roared, then subscribe to our channel. Here, we believe that the most powerful voice is often the one that has waited the longest to speak. Your home. Welcome.